There are two kind of people in your life. There are those that drain you, and there are those that fill you, okay? There are those that breathe life into you. And the way you know the difference is when you walk into the house or you walk into your office at work and you're handed a note, hey, so-and-so called, they want you to call them. What's your first reaction? I mean, if the first reaction is, oh my goodness, then they are not one who fills, they're one who drains. They don't breathe life into you, they're a sucker. They suck life out, okay? Now, on the other hand, do you know people in your life today that when you think of them, you smile? When you see them walking down a hall, instead of trying to find another way, and let's be honest, how many of you have ever gone another way in the building where you work or in your neighborhood because you didn't want to go in front of or see somebody? Raise your hand if you've ever done that. Thank you. My hand's lifted. To those of you that didn't, you were lying in church. Because I know you have done that. I want to be one of those that brings life into a room, not suck all the air out. I want to be somebody that refreshes. This is a story about a guy who was just that. He refreshed. And he brought life to Paul. And his name, it's hard to pronounce. I think the correct pronunciation is Onesiphorus, because the accent in most of the biblical dictionaries that you look up this name, the accent is on the PH sound. So you got to get the accent on the right syllable for it to make sense. So here we go. Onesiphorus. And he is a man that we know very little about. But what we know, unbelievable. So with the Bible open, 2 Timothy chapter 1, let's start in verse 15. You are aware that all who were in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly, and he found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. 2 Timothy chapter 1. I believe the last book that Paul wrote. And so I think one of the best ways to go at this is to first look, what is the context? Where was Paul? Because it adds a dimension to what he says about this man when you really ask the question, where is he? And it's two answers. One, in chains. You see, Paul was in prison twice. Follow me here for a moment. When you read the book of Acts and you get to the end of Acts, Acts 28, verse 30, talks about him being under house arrest. That was his first imprisonment in Rome. I believe he was released, and then maybe a couple of years later, we can't be sure, he was called back to Rome. This time, he was not under house arrest. This time, he was in what we know today as the Mamertine prison. Let me show you a picture. We went there. We go there every time I do a Journeys of Paul trip, and it's always a moving thing. Here's the outside of it today, okay? Obviously, some of the facade is not dating back to the time of Paul, but there is a part that I believe is. Inside of this, you find that. It is literally, you have to walk down these little steps, and it's like a hole in the ground. It's like a dungeon. They would keep prisoners there until they executed them. And one of the reasons they would keep them there is basically to humiliate them. It was cold, it was damp, it was horrible conditions. I believe that's where he wrote this letter. I believe he was in that hole in the ground called a prison when he wrote 2 Timothy. A letter to a young pastor named Timothy. Now, when I stood there with the group this last time we went, I can tell you I lost it right there. Because I'm standing there in this hole in the ground, and I'm thinking about what I read in 2 Timothy and the faith of Paul and how Paul was so optimistic and he was so hopeful and he never gave up and he never lost faith. I just didn't realize that might have been because of a guy named Onesiphorus. Because he visits Paul in that hole. And so here Paul is in chains. He's in a hole in the ground. We know it's cold because he asked for a cloak in the 4th chapter of this letter. He asked for a cloak. There are actual stories of prisoners who died from illness before they ever were executed because of the conditions of that hole in the ground called a prison. So here's Paul. He's in this prison, and he's in Rome. Now, Rome was no small city, as you know. Rome was huge. And that prison is near one of the Acropolis, what's called the Acropolis. I mean, it's at the very center of the life in Rome. And you remember the Colosseum wasn't built yet when Paul was executed. Colosseum comes later. That's the picture you see of Rome most often. That wasn't there. But the Acropolis was. And so here's a prison right in the middle of this busy city, and Paul is alone. Hey, have you ever noticed that some of the loneliest moments you've had are in a crowd? It's kind of funny how that happens sometimes. Here Paul is in a big old city, and the only one we know who was with him was Luke, the doctor who wrote this account in Acts, and now we hear it from Paul's own mouth. And so where was he? He's in prison in a big old city, and he's all alone. How did he feel? Exactly, all alone. In fact, look what it says, the very first verse we read, verse 15. You are aware that all who are in Asia turned away from me. And the word turn away literally means to desert. I mean, it is a graphic picture of turning your back on somebody. So all of those who were in Ephesus, they're not with him. In fact, they turned their back on him. And then he even says in the 4th chapter that when he came in his first defense in Rome, nobody stood with him. Nobody was there with him. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed. Nobody was with him. Remember? Even Peter, James, and John, they fell asleep. But Jesus prayed by himself. Here's Paul by himself. And it's interesting to me that when you read chapter 4, verse 16, he actually prays the Lord forgives them, does not lay that to their account. How would you feel if you were in a hole in a dungeon and all your friends walked away from you? Would you say, Lord, bless them? Or would you say, Lord, burn them up, get them. Look at what they've done to me. Paul said, bless them, forgive them. But he felt all alone. Now, was it right that nobody in Asia, nobody was there for him? Well, that's debatable, but have you ever felt like nobody was there? You ever been in those moments where everybody, there was no one that could understand what you were walking through and what you were going through? Chuck Swindoll, one of my favorite teachers, when he talks about this, he does something with the football. Let me show you. Throw it. Oh, that's much better. Cyrus threw one up, and I had to make this amazing catch, but I caught it in the first service, didn't I? Chuck Swindoll said every Saturday and Sunday in the fall, this ball is precious. In fact, it is so precious that the object of the game is to get this ball across a goal line. And in the process of getting across the goal line, don't drop it. Because if you drop it, there'll be a dog pile and a fight to try to get it. And when it's thrown to you, catch it. When it's handed off to you, protect it. In fact, today, cradle it. And when you run with it now, you don't hold it like a loaf of bread. They teach you to cradle it and to wrap it up. Why? Because it's the most precious thing in the world. And then, for some strange reason, when you cross the goal line, what do you do with it? You spike it. What is the deal with that? You've cradled it like a baby, you've held it, you've protected it, you've cherished it, and now you throw it on the ground. And Swindoll says, that's exactly how Paul felt. Yeah, one time he was a hero. At one time, everybody wanted to be his friend. Hey, it's all fun and games till somebody gets thrown in prison. And then they left. And there's some of you in this room that know exactly what that football feels like. Yeah, you used to be the life of the party. You used to have friends galore, and then something happened, and maybe you ran out of money. Maybe your fortunes changed. Maybe something changed, and you feel like everybody has turned their back on you. That's how Paul felt. Now, what did he remember? Who does he remember? It's very interesting that Paul remembers those who deserted him and those who refreshed him. And those who refreshed him would be one. Those who deserted him, look at the way he says this. You're aware that all in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygelus and Hermogenes. Now, he remembers them by name. We don't know who these guys are. I'll just tell you, I mean, you can do the research, you can read all the commentaries, scholars you want. We don't know who these guys were. I have an idea, I have a suspicion. I'm not alone in this. There are many who believe this. I think these guys were leaders in the church in Ephesus on the Aegean coast in Asia Minor. I think they were leaders. I think they might have been elders in the church. And so why would Paul call them out? Because of all people, the leaders should have been with him. Because Paul was with them. Timothy was their pastor. Paul was their leader in the church, and they turned their back on him. Now, Hermogenes, listen to that name. Have you ever drank homogenized milk? The word homogenize means to mix up thoroughly. So now when you drink milk, remember I'm just kidding. It has nothing to do with Hermogenes, but doesn't it sound like homogenized? Just to a few crazy folks in here. Hermogenes, Phygelus will forever be known for what they didn't do. Think about it. Of all things you could get in the scripture for, of all things that you could make this and get a little press in the Bible, they make the Bible for what they didn't do. That's a horrible thought. Can you imagine one day walking the streets of heaven and you run into a guy and he introduces himself as Hermogenes? And you're going, wait a minute, I know that name. Oh, you're the one that turned his back on Paul. Forever. They are recorded in the scripture forever as the guys who turned their back on Paul. I'm telling you, for Paul, this was a meaningful moment. And he remembered those that deserted, but in the same way, he remembered those who what? Refreshed. And the one he remembers is named Onesiphorus. So now, ordinary servant, a man by the name of Onesiphorus. Do you know his name literally means to bring help? I just think that's fascinating how names tend to mean something. Names just have a way of developing character. And you know, true story, Paul Harvey said there was a guy who was robbing everywhere. He was robbing Burger Kings. That's the only place he would rob. When they caught him, you know what his name was? Ronald McDonald. I'm just saying, true story. There's something about a name. So here is Onesiphorus, whose name means to bring help. And what does he do? He refreshes. Go back to the text. Look at what he says. I'm reading verse 16. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. He often refreshed me. That's the phrase that never occurs anywhere else in the Bible. That is a phrase that is never said about anyone else. The word refresh is a compound word. In Greek, it's one word. It is basically a combination of the preposition ana, or again, and suko, from which we get psycho. Really, psyche. Your psyche is kind of your soul. You take that word and you put ana with it, and it's almost like you get a soul again. That's what he did. He refreshed him. I like that English translation. I think that's probably the best translation. But here's the way I often say it. He breathed life into him. Have you ever said of somebody, they are a breath of fresh air? That's exactly what he is. It's somebody who breathed life into him. Can you think of somebody right now in your life that's done that? Can you think of somebody that just breathed? They just were a breath of fresh air to you. They didn't suck like life out. They didn't suck air out. They breathed life into you. I'm going to introduce a couple of people this morning. They just happen to be here today, and it's just appropriate that I introduce them. We have Dr. Phil Jett, who pastored Englewood Baptist Church in Jackson, Tennessee, for years, and set that church on a course for missions. And Dr. Jett is one of the most encouraging people I've ever been around, and I've preached and taught with him being sitting out in the crowd, and he would always come up and breathe life into me. Phil, you never sucked the life out of me. You never said that was pitiful. You gave me encouragement. You gave me criticism. You helped me. But he breathed life into me. And he's sitting right here with his new wife, Karen. Would you guys stand up? I just want the church to meet you. Dr. Phil Jett. Now, are you talking about a ripple effect? Dr. Jett influenced a builder in Jackson, Tennessee, who, as I was told this week by one of his friends who sits in the row in front of him, Roy and Beth Heatherly, Gary Taylor has built most of Jackson, Tennessee. Quite honestly, he is a developer and has a construction company. God used Phil Jett to put in his heart a heart for the nations. So Gary Taylor has been going to Brazil how many years? 25 years, using his own money, building churches, building health clinics, building an orphanage. It doesn't matter what. Gary's been going for 25 years. So every year I go to Brazil, this is the guy I go with. Here is Gary Taylor, his wife Lisa. You guys stand up. They refresh me. They bless me. Thank you, Gary and Lisa. When I'm around them, they just breathe life into me. Now, do you know somebody like that? That they just breathe life? Okay, that's this man. He breathed life. Paul said he came often and he refreshed me. So I've got a question. What is it that he did that would make Paul say what he never says about anybody else? How was it he did that? And it's just three things that I want you to notice in your listening guide. Number one, he made a choice to be a refresher. He made a choice. If you go to the text, there's a very interesting way that Paul says this. I'm reading verse 17. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly, and he found me. It's almost as if Paul is saying, when he got to Rome, he didn't do what everybody else did. He searched for me. But when he got to Rome. You see, I think that to be a breath of fresh air or one who sucks life out is your choice. I think you choose to be a refresher or you choose to be a drainer. And unlike all those in Asia, he chose, I'm going to go and refresh Paul. I'm not turning my back on Paul. I'm going to go refresh him. It is your choice. You know what? I'm a little weary of us blaming our parents because of the attitudes we carry around as adults. And I just think the day has come, we got to own who we are, and if we're not a refresher, if we suck the life out of everybody we run into, then we need to get before God and deal with it. It is not anybody's fault but ours. We choose how we live our life among the brethren. We choose. And so I'm just encouraging you today, it's your choice. You can be a refresher, or you can be one that sucks the life out. But whenever you get called on it, when people are not your friend, when they are trying to avoid you, don't blame it on somebody else. Just own it and realize you really got a problem. Because I can't imagine a follower of Christ not being somebody who breathes life. That's who Jesus is. He breathed life everywhere he went. So why would not his followers be the same way. It starts with a choice. Second thing, when you read this text, it becomes very obvious. This man, Onesiphorus, took risk. He took big risk. And Paul said he wasn't afraid of my chains. He wasn't ashamed of my chains. Can I just tell you that it's funny how these characters that we're looking at in the scripture, how the common theme among so many of them is risk. They took risk. I think you have to take a risk if you're going to be a refresher. If you're going to breathe life into somebody, you have to take risk. It doesn't take any risk at all to suck life out of people. Just be yourself. Just be your old sinful self, and you're going to suck the life out of everybody you meet. But it takes people who are willing to risk it. Why? Because chains have stigma. Chains have stigmas attached to them. The fact that he would be willing to go and be by Paul's side, he could have been arrested himself. I mean, he could have been arrested himself, but it didn't bother him. He was willing to find him and to be there with him. I just think chains have stigmas. And guess what? There's a thing called the chains of sin. And there's a risk you and I run when we go stand with sinners and try to impart grace. We get accused. And by the way, so did Jesus. You remember what they said about Jesus? Remember what the Pharisees said about him? He's a friend of sinners. You remember? He hangs out with sinners. And the Pharisees couldn't believe he was guilty by association. I remember learning this lesson in my first church. I'd been there 2 months. And Dr. Jed, I went to see a family that the people in the church had told me they had dropped out of church and they'd had some major issues, and they had a child that was a wild child, and they had just a lot of stuff going on. And so I went by to see them. I parked my car right outside their house. I went in to see them. Their life was messed up. They were struggling with alcoholism. They had a kid in rebellion. Man, I just went in and said, you know what? Y'all been away from church long enough. It's time to come back. Because you need the Lord right now. You got all this stuff going on in your life. You need Christ. Do you know what the next deacon meeting revealed to me? A deacon stood up in the meeting and said, Pastor, we've got a problem we need to talk to you about. We noticed your car was parked outside of so-and-so's house. And we just don't think it's appropriate for the pastor of our church to be associated with a family like that. I'm serious. I was pastor for 2 months when I learned this lesson. And he said, we just think it's better that you not associate with people like that because we want the reputation of our church to stay positive and good. And you know what I said? Well, I thought that's why Jesus came, is to hang out with sinners like them and like you. And I didn't realize it was the healthy that need a physician. I thought it was the sick, is what Jesus said. And Jesus said he came to seek and to save that which is lost. They're lost. Well, Pastor, we just don't think you need to associate. We don't think you need to be around them. Well, let me tell you what. 35 years later, I am not ashamed to associate with any sinner on this planet because it is by the grace of God that they have as much hope as I do. I just learned that you're going to be guilty by association. You're going to have people say things. You're going to be accused of things all because you went and stood with somebody. And that's what this man, Onesiphorus, did. He went and stood with me. He wasn't ashamed of his chains. See, everybody else ran when the chains came out. But not this man. He said, I don't care about the chains. I'm standing here for you. So he took risk. And I just tell you, it takes risk if you're going to be a refresher to people. You're going to be accused of motives that are less than pure. You're going to have people say all kind of stuff. But I promise you, in heaven, there will be the Son of Man himself applauding you because you look just like him. So go stand with him and be there for him. The last thing, he was committed to it. It took a commitment for Onesiphorus to do this. I mean, it took a real commitment. And I want to show you something that you might have missed. The last verse that I read was verse 18. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus. What I want you to know is Paul doesn't say that Onesiphorus just turned into a servant when he got to Rome. He was already a servant in Ephesus, their home. He was already living that kind of lifestyle. He was already using the gifts God had given him to encourage and refresh. I just think that's interesting because I've noticed that people go on mission trips and expect to be turned into a missionary when they get there. And I kind of got a conviction that if you don't care about sharing Jesus here, why are you going to care about sharing Jesus in Brazil? What's going to be magically transforming about an airplane ride? You're going to be tired. That's all you're going to be. But I see so many times churches that talk about missions. Listen, I was in one. They talked about missions and how much we want to give to missions. And I said, well, let's start a ministry in the neighborhood down the street that there's a lot of need. And they looked at me and said, Pastor, we're not interested in that. We want to be involved in missions. To which I said, well, let me tell you something. If you don't care about the person across the street, you don't give a rip about Africa either. You're playing a game to make yourself look good. That is not a follower of Christ. That is a Pharisee, and I'm going to call it what it is. We must be servants where we are, because going somewhere else doesn't change anything. It starts here. That's why, as a church, Love Orlando is about what we do here. It's about neighborhoods right here, because we don't want to be that church that's guilty of saying we care about the nations, we just don't care about those folks over there. We care about them. Onesiphorus didn't wait till he got to Rome. He was a servant already in Ephesus. But when he got to Rome, you're talking about commitment? Look at what Paul says to him or about him. He says, when he got to Rome, and I'm reading verse 17, he searched for me earnestly and he found me. It wasn't like Onesiphorus knew where he was because he had it on his phone and he could go to Google Maps and it would take him right to Paul. It wasn't like it was an easy deal. Look, he didn't know where he was. Rome's a big city. And by the way, he had to look and find, and I love the way Paul says it. He looked for me earnestly. You know what I almost think Paul is doing? I almost think Paul is saying, and I really needed to be found. He didn't give up. He searched for me earnestly, and I really needed to be found. You ever had one of those moments where you needed somebody to find you? You needed somebody to show up. Well, that's what he did. He earnestly searched. I love this quote, and I apologize for reading to you, but the power of this quote, when I read it, I thought, oh my goodness, what a description of a man named Onesiphorus. We seem to catch glimpses of one purposeful face in a drifting crowd, and we follow with quickening interest this stranger from the far coast of the Aegean, that would be Ephesus. As he threads the maze of unfamiliar streets, knocking at many doors there in Rome, following up every clue, warned of the risk he was taking, but not to be turned away from his quest, until in some obscure prison, a known voice greets him, and he discovers Paul. Can you imagine what that must have felt like when he finally heard Paul's voice? What do you think it felt like to Paul? When all of a sudden he hears this voice and he recognizes it as his buddy from back in Ephesus, Onesiphorus. Don't you know that was an incredible moment? And by the way, to show you how committed he was to find Paul, he didn't just find him once. Did you see the little word often? The little word often back in verse 16, he often refreshed me. The word often doesn't mean he showed up one time. That's not a one-hit wonder. That's somebody that keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. So Paul, of all people, said the guy that breathed life into me was a man by the name of Onesiphorus. And you know what I thought as I looked at those pictures again of that prison? Who knows but what we have 2 Timothy because Onesiphorus was there at the right moment to refresh and to breathe life back into the apostle who was so discouraged in that moment. So what are the extraordinary impacts? There's two. Two from an ordinary servant named Onesiphorus. Here's two. Number one, a life blessed. Whose life? Onesiphorus. His life was blessed. Did you see where Paul blessed him? Paul gave him a blessing. Paul said, may the Lord grant him mercy. I mean, you got to read this. He does it twice. I'm in verse 16. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus. And then again in verse 18, may the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. So in other words, it's funny. Have you ever had one of those moments where you went to be an encouragement, you went to bless somebody, and the result was you were blessed? I think that's what happens when you refresh people. You are blessed more. And Paul said, may the Lord bless him. Here's a real interesting idea. Follow me on this. Isn't it interesting he refers to the household? And then it's interesting that he talks about mercy in both places. Both blessings have the word mercy in it. And isn't it interesting, one of them is on that day, the day, and that is the day we stand before the Lord. There's a good number of commentators who believe when Paul wrote this, Onesiphorus was dead. He wasn't alive. That's why in the greeting at the very end of the book, he says, greet the household of Onesiphorus. And could it be, I'm just kind of thinking out of the box, could it be Onesiphorus died on the way back? Could it be he died because of Paul? I can tell you this, I don't know the answer to that, but that man was a blessed man. When the Apostle Paul prayed, the Lord bless him, the Lord blessed him and granted him mercy. I think that's Paul's way of saying, Lord, when he stands before you, remember what he did for your servant Paul. Can't tell you how many times I've prayed that for people that bless my life. I've prayed a simple prayer like Hebrews 6 that's quoted there. And I can't believe I'm quoting the message. Danny is very proud of me today. But listen to this. God doesn't miss a thing. He knows perfectly well all the love you've shown him by helping Christians in need, and that you keep at it. I've prayed that God would remember things that people did. Lord, on that day, would you remember what they did for me, your servant, or my family? Remember them. That's what Paul was saying. So Onesiphorus' life was blessed. And so will yours be when you choose to refresh. And then Paul was blessed. Paul was refreshed. Who knows, as I said, but what we have this letter because Paul all of a sudden had life again, and life came back to him. And guys, here's what's so wild about this. When you read the account that we've just read this morning, you don't read one word about what Onesiphorus said to Paul. It doesn't say a word about what he said. Now, I know in your mind's eye and the way we kind of think of it, we probably thought or think Onesiphorus showed up and gave Paul a Bible study, or gave him a podcast that he heard that really blessed his life and he wanted to share it. We don't know that. I just think it's interesting that what he remembers about this man is not what he said, but what he did. He just showed up. It's called the ministry of presence. He just showed up. I think you underestimate your power and the power of God's blessing through your showing up in somebody's life. I think you underestimate how God uses you on a Sunday morning. Let me just tell you this story of a friend of mine, Robert Jeffress. He's pastor of First Baptist Dallas today. You might have seen him in the news. He's been quoted a lot. He used to pastor Wichita Falls First Baptist. And in Wichita Falls, he got into a little conflict. I don't remember all the details, but the church, many of them wanted him to leave and thought that he should resign. And they thought he was the reason that the church was having trouble. And so he was at a business meeting, and a guy came to the microphone and said, I move that we ask for your resignation. Well, when Robert heard it, he was taken back, obviously. And so he did what every pastor should do. Is there a second? And several yelled out, second. So he said, okay, sir, you made the motion. You can speak to it. Then we'll have someone speak against it. So the guy went on about how he thought the pastor was the reason the church was having trouble and all this stuff. Then he said, okay, is there anyone who would like to speak against this? And this older lady got up in the back of the room. Godly woman. She starts forward. And she goes by every microphone. So Robert said, I wasn't sure what to do at that point. I thought, well, man, she's coming up here by me. So he steps aside to let her speak from the microphone there at the front. And she walks right by that one and comes right over and stands right by him. And he said, would you like to say something? And she said, no. I didn't come to say anything. I just came to stand with my pastor. And all of a sudden, everything in that room changed because of one woman who never said a word. She just stood with her pastor. There's a girl who blogs from our church. Brilliant, wonderful writer. She wrote a blog one day about going through a miscarriage and the pain. And she was so honest. She said, I skipped life group that day because I didn't want to lie to people when they asked me, how am I doing? I didn't want to play the game and said, I'm doing fine. Because she said I was hurting. She said, I walked into the worship center and I sat by myself. And as the worship started, it was the song, Your Grace is Enough. And she said, I just stood there in private worship, just crying out to God and just kind of lost in that moment. And then all of a sudden I felt arms and hands around me. And she looked up and it was her friend who had seen her across this room and said, I didn't want to see you standing alone. And I just came to stand with you. She wrote the most amazing blog about how that ministered. No words, just standing. And I believe with all my heart, there's a trend in the church today that's very troubling to me, and I need to share it with you, and I want you to hear my heart. The trend today in the church is that if you come once a month, you're considered regular attender at a church. That's pitiful. And let me tell you why. I know you think it's because, well, that's because the pastor wants to fill the room up. No. Let me tell you why it's horrible. Yes, you can worship out there by yourself somewhere. You can worship at home. I'm not about to tell you that the only place God shows up is at First Baptist Orlando. That's crazy. But here's what you don't realize. Somebody here needs the ministry of your presence. Somebody here needs to see you. And they may not even know who you are. But you're standing with them in worship. Your being here sends a message to them. It encourages them. So I'm just going to tell you, once a month is not enough. Because if you can't think of anybody that might need to see you, then I'll give you one. That would be me. Because when I look in this room and I look in the eyes of the people in this room, the ministry of your presence, you don't have to say a word to me. But you're here. And that says a lot. You remember the story I told about Dale? About how he flew seven bombing missions over Berlin, and then he got to fly the Berlin airlift and drop candy, all those parachutes. Well, there's another part of the story. Because there was a little girl whose brother took her outside in Berlin. She grew up in Berlin. And her brother took her outside, and she looked up in the sky, and she saw candy from the Americans. She had never had candy, never had chocolate. And she said when she saw these parachutes coming from these American bombers, she said to herself, one day, I want to go to that country. I want to go to America. And guess what? She did. And she's here today. Barbara Kaiser. So, you know why she's sitting by Dale? Because she's met him and she said thank you to him. Because I know Dale, when he dropped that candy, you don't know if it makes a difference. You hope it does. But that's the thing about ripple effect. You don't always know what the effect of one ordinary servant can be. Well, right here today is a beautiful picture of the ripple effect of an American soldier dropping candy. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you. So my question to you, you want to be a sucker? I have to be careful how I say this. Or you want to breathe life? You want to be a refresher or you want to be a drainer? It's your choice. As for me, may I spend the rest of my days breathing life into people.